I spent 10 years building a life with a man who looked at me like I was the best decision he had ever made. And if you had asked me back then what I was most proud of, I would have said our marriage without hesitation, because from the outside, everything about us looked stable, successful, and almost annoyingly perfect in a way that made people assume we had somehow figured things out better than everyone else. What I didn't know at the time was that the man sleeping next to me every night had already built a second life that I was never supposed to see, and the only reason I found out was because of a random decision on an ordinary day that he never expected would matter. And the worst part is not even that he cheated on me, but that he truly believed I would never find out. And even if I did, I would be too emotionally invested, too comfortable, and too dependent on what we had built together to ever do anything about it. He was wrong. I was 12 years older than him when we met, already established, already financially secure, already at a point in my life where I was not looking for games, instability, or someone who needed to be figured out. And he came into my world with this effortless charm that made everything feel lighter, easier, and just unpredictable enough to be exciting without feeling dangerous. He knew exactly how to position himself, how to listen, how to say the right things at the right time, and how to make me feel like choosing him was not a risk but an upgrade. And for a long time, I genuinely believed that I had found someone who appreciated what I had built rather than someone who was quietly calculating how to benefit from it. When we got married, it felt like a natural next step rather than a leap of faith, because by then he had fully integrated himself into my life, my routines, my social circle, and eventually my finances, and I convinced myself that supporting his ambitions was part of being a good partner, not realizing that I was slowly handing over control in ways that would later be used against me. The business was my idea, my investment, and my risk, even though on paper it was in his name because at the time it felt easier, cleaner, and frankly more romantic to frame it as something I was helping him build rather than something I was strategically structuring to protect myself. I told myself that trust mattered more than technicalities, that love made things shared by default, and that keeping score in a marriage was a sign of insecurity, so I ignored the small voice in the back of my mind that occasionally asked questions I didn't want to answer. For a while, everything seemed to validate my decisions because the company started doing well, he became more confident, more driven, and outwardly more devoted, and I took that as proof that I had chosen correctly, that I had invested not just money, but belief into the right person. Looking back now, I can see that what I interpreted as gratitude was actually dependency, and what I thought was love was something much more conditional, much more opportunistic, and much more fragile than I was willing to admit at the time. The changes did not happen all at once, which is probably why I allowed them to slide for as long as I did, because they came in small, almost reasonable pieces that could always be explained away if I wanted them to be. He started staying late at the office more often, which made sense given that the business was growing, and I told myself that this was exactly what success looked like: long hours, constant pressure, and less time for everything else. Then his phone became something I was no longer casually allowed to touch, not in an obvious or confrontational way, but in subtle shifts that made it clear there were boundaries that hadn't existed before, and instead of questioning it directly, I adjusted, because I didn't want to be the kind of person who creates problems where there are none. There was also a certain distance that I could feel but not quite define, like he was present in the same room, but no longer fully engaged in the same reality, and every time I noticed it, I found a way to rationalize it: stress, fatigue, pressure, anything that allowed me to maintain the version of our relationship that still made sense. What I didn't realize then was that by choosing not to look too closely, I was giving him exactly the space he needed to build something I would eventually have to destroy. If I am being honest, the first real warning did not come from him, but from the atmosphere around him, because people often notice a shift before there is anything concrete enough to confront, and that was exactly what started happening in the office. The receptionist, who had always greeted me warmly, became strangely careful around me, as if every casual interaction required thought, and there were moments when I caught employees looking away too quickly, which by itself meant nothing, but together created the unmistakable feeling that I was the last person in the room to understand something everyone else had already sensed. I still did not let myself jump to betrayal, because once you name a fear like that, you cannot put it back where it came from, and I was not ready to destroy my marriage over suspicion, intuition, or a collection of details that could still be explained by stress and overwork. Then the inconsistencies started multiplying in ways that felt too precise to be accidental. He mentioned meetings that left no trace on the calendar, clients whose names changed depending on when I asked, and late nights at the office that somehow produced less transparency instead of more. I began to notice unfamiliar charges, small at first, and then increasingly deliberate, expenses that made no sense in the context of the business I had financed and helped structure from the ground up. The truth is that when a woman starts connecting details, she usually already knows far more than she is willing to say out loud. I was not gathering facts because I was curious anymore. I was gathering facts because something inside me had already shifted from trust to verification, and once that happens, the relationship is no longer resting on love, but on evidence. The day everything changed was not dramatic when it began. It was one of those ordinary afternoons that seemed too unremarkable to carry any permanent consequence. I had finished earlier than expected, and for reasons I still cannot fully explain, I decided to stop by the office and bring him coffee. It was not an attempt to catch him. It was not some suspicious, impulsive act driven by jealousy. It was the kind of thoughtless kindness that only exists when someone still believes there is something worth preserving. I remember walking into the building with that calm, familiar confidence of someone who had every reason to be there because in the most literal sense, I did. That company existed because I had backed it, funded it, and trusted him with an opportunity he could never have created on his own. Even though the paperwork carried his name, the foundation had been mine from the beginning, and every wall in that place represented a decision I had made in his favor. The floor was unusually quiet, though not in a way that immediately felt alarming. It was the kind of silence that only becomes suspicious in retrospect. The receptionist looked up, saw me, and froze for half a second too long. It was brief, almost invisible, but once you have seen that kind of expression, you never forget it. She did not stop me, and she did not warn me. She simply looked like someone caught between guilt and self-preservation. I kept walking. As I approached his office, I heard laughter from behind the door, low and intimate in a way that did not belong in the middle of a workday. I slowed down without fully understanding why, and then I saw through the narrow gap, where the door had not been closed all the way. He was standing close to a woman I had never seen before, close enough that there was no room left for denial, and the body language between them carried that effortless familiarity that only exists when a line has been crossed many times before. This was not flirtation that had just happened in a reckless moment. This was comfort. This was repetition. This was a relationship that had already become routine. For a second, everything in me went completely still. I did not gasp, I did not shake, and I did not burst into tears the way people imagine betrayal works when they have only experienced it from a distance. What I felt instead was a kind of internal silence, so absolute that it made everything else sharper. I noticed the angle of his shoulders, the way she touched his arm as if she belonged there, the carelessness in his face because he thought he was safe. Neither of them saw me, and that, more than anything, was what saved me. If they had looked up, if he had seen me in that doorway, there would have been excuses, panic, pleading, and some rushed performance designed to force the moment into chaos before I had time to think. Instead, I had the rarest possible advantage in a situation like that. I had the truth, and he had no idea that I had it. So I turned around and left. I walked back through the office with the same controlled pace I had entered with, got into my car, put the coffee in the cup holder untouched, and sat there long enough to let the emotional part of me burn itself out before it could do anything stupid. I was humiliated, furious, and more deeply insulted than heartbroken, because in that moment I understood something bigger than the affair itself. He had not just betrayed me. He had been using me, and he had done it with the confidence of someone who believed I was too blind, too loyal, or too predictable to ever become a threat. That was the exact moment I stopped being his wife in the emotional sense and started becoming the person who would dismantle everything he thought he controlled. I did not call him. I did not text him. I did not confront him that night, or the next morning, or even that week. I let him come home and act normal. I let him kiss me with a face that had already learned how to lie without effort. I let him tell me about his day while I sat there and looked at a man I suddenly understood with terrifying clarity. Once the shock passed, strategy took its place, and strategy is much more useful than pain. Because the company may have been operating under his name, but the systems behind it were not beyond my reach. The money that launched it had come through me. The administrative structure had been built with my input. The security infrastructure, including the office cameras, had originally been installed through vendors I knew and approved. There were records, permissions, archived communications, account trails, reimbursement logs, and access points he had never bothered to think about because men like him rarely imagined the woman financing their life might also be intelligent enough to audit it. The first thing I did was preserve everything I could access without alerting him. I copied financial records, flagged irregular transactions, and secured documentation connected to the company's internal expenses. Then I reviewed the office footage, and what I found confirmed exactly what I had already suspected. She had not been there once. She had been there often. She came in during hours that had no business purpose, stayed longer than any client would, and moved through that office like someone who had been informally integrated into his private version of the space. After that, I started tracing his digital carelessness, and eventually I found what men like him always leave behind when they become too comfortable. There were messages, deleted threads that were not as deleted as he assumed, and conversations full of the kind of arrogance that only appears when someone thinks they are winning. He spoke about me as if I were an obstacle made tolerable by money. He reduced our marriage to convenience, described my support as something he had earned through performance, and spoke about a future in which he would somehow walk away with the lifestyle I had built while painting himself as the one who had outsmarted everyone. By the time I finished reading, I no longer felt confused about what I had to do. I felt focused. This was no longer about a cheating husband and a humiliating affair. This was about fraud wrapped in intimacy, manipulation disguised as marriage, and a man who had mistaken my generosity for weakness. He still believed he was living two lives successfully, but what he did not understand was that from the moment I walked away from that office door without being seen, one of those lives had already started collapsing. By the time I spoke to a lawyer, I was no longer acting on emotion, and that made all the difference, because instead of telling a story about betrayal, I presented a structured case built on documentation, timelines, financial flows, and clear evidence of misconduct that extended far beyond a simple affair. He still thought we were living in the same version of reality, where I was supportive, trusting, and completely unaware, and that illusion gave me the time I needed to secure everything that mattered before he even considered the possibility that something was wrong. We moved carefully, deliberately, and without any unnecessary noise. Assets were reviewed, accounts were protected, and every piece of evidence was organized in a way that would not just expose him, but corner him. The affair was only one layer, but the financial misuse, the misrepresentation, and the way he had leveraged my investments for his personal life created a much stronger position than he could have imagined. When everything was ready, I did not warn him. He found out the same way people like him always do, suddenly, publicly, and without control. He was served. I remember the exact moment because of how quickly his confidence collapsed into confusion. He kept repeating that there had to be some kind of mistake, that I would never do something like this without talking to him first, that we could fix whatever he thought the problem was, and for the first time in a long time, I let him talk without interrupting him. Then I showed him. Not everything, just enough. Enough to make it clear that I knew about the office, about her, about the messages, about the money, and about the version of our marriage he had been describing behind my back. I watched his expression change as he realized that this was not a conversation he could manipulate or a situation he could charm his way out of. What shocked him the most was not that I knew, but that I had known for a while. Because that meant every normal day he thought we were having had already been something else entirely. The process that followed was not dramatic in the way people expect, because real consequences rarely are. There were no screaming matches, no desperate scenes, and no emotional negotiations. There were documents, court dates, legal arguments, and a slow, systematic dismantling of everything he had assumed was secure. The company, which he believed was his, became the center of the case, and once the financial structure was fully examined, it became very difficult for him to argue ownership in the way he had imagined. The money trail did not lie, and neither did the records of how that business had been built, maintained, and ultimately used. By the time it was over, the version of the future he had been planning no longer existed. And the most ironic part of all of it was that he did not lose everything because I wanted revenge. He lost everything because he had built his life on the assumption that I would never defend what was mine. So, tell me, would you stay and keep quiet, pretending you don't know anything, or would you do exactly what I did? If stories like this hit you, subscribe.